All right, so we left off. People can hear me? Yes. It's a it's a yes. People can hear me. People are conscious of me. Am I making sound? Are you hearing the sound? Is anybody there? Hello? Uh, can anyone hear me? Anyone? Right. It does not seem that anybody's actually attending.
I can hear you.
Oh, okay. Okay, good. That's what I need to hear. All right, it's fine.
I think people may have been confused about whether this was taking place on the holiday.
Okay. All right. I mean, we just cancel and do this again next week?
I'm here and it's going to be recorded. So
Okay,
people
well,
might
then
hear it.
let's get going. No problem. I'm here. All right, so um we left off with the end of the 1950s. And things looking great for Nasser. He had um you know lost to the Israelis, but even that was able to sort of pitch it as a sort of real, only because the English and French had intervened. Um, he was standing atop the Arab world, right? He was recognized as the leader of the pan-Arab movement. There's no Arab leader who was anywhere comparable to him. In 1958 or so, Egypt and Syria merged with the United Arab Republic. It looked like perhaps Lebanon and Iraq might be joining them. Everything was looking, fantastic for him. And then, very early in the 1960s, things started to go badly for Nasser. Turns out that the Lebanese and Iraqi nationalists, did not care to join with him. The Syrians felt that, although they had imagined a, sort of alliance of equals, that the Egyptians sort of, took all the best positions for themselves. And they left, right, the UAR in 1962, although Egypt still called itself the UAR. And then Nasser gets involved in this war in Yemen. So what had happened is that Yemen, which was a sort of traditional, emirate or monarchy, a group of Nasserites had launched a revolution. Nasser thought this would be a good opportunity to sort of recapture some of his faded glory, and spread Nasserite ideas. He began supporting the revolutionaries. The Saudis, who were rivals of Nasser, support the monarchy. The end result is that, Nasser finds himself in this kind of like, unwinnable war, where he's pumping more and more troops and supplies and money into winning this war in Yemen. He certainly can't compete financially with the Saudis. His sort of status as the leader of the Arab world is kind of declining, if for no other reason that he's, killing other Arabs and using poison gas and so forth. So Nasser, by the mid 1960s, has really seen a decline in his status. And his rivals, particularly the conservative monarchies, the Saudis and the Hashemites in Jordan, are really playing on this, right? Bringing up the fact that Nasser is supposedly the great, defender of the Arab people, is spending his time fighting other Arabs while leaving the Israelis alone, right? And I point out that at this point there is a United Nations force that's on the borders between Israel and Egypt, including Gaza. And even though Fedayeen attacks are continuing, they're largely coming from Jordanian and Syrian territory, right? Nasser is kind of, backed off on this. And Israel is given a certain amount of breathing room, right? So where after years of dealing with incursions from the Fedayeen in Gaza, Israel is now able to sort of begin to pursue its own goals and not necessarily worry about an Egyptian attack so much. They still, through most of the early 1960s, have the backing of France, which is not a great power anymore, but provides them weapons and nuclear reactor and whatnot. So Israel is doing well for itself. Israeli operations against Egypt were largely intelligence operations and assassinations. So Nasser had been recruiting German rocket scientists, right? Not the best German rocket scientists, because the United States had those working at NASA, but sort of second tier old Nazi rocket scientists to develop missiles to attack Israel. The Israelis began launching a campaign to assassinate these scientists. With a certain amount of success, they were sending letter bombs and occasionally just hunting them down and assassinating them in other ways. Before this eventually came to a close. And then they also began putting pressure on the German government. It was not a good look for West Germany for former Nazi scientists to be working on rockets to attack Israel. And one of the interesting outgrowths of this, which came on in the last few years, is that the Mossad seems to have recruited Otto Skorzeny. Skorzeny is the gentleman seen in this picture over here, who was Hitler's favorite commando. When Mussolini had been taken prisoner by the fascists in 1943, it was Skorzeny who rescued him so that Hitler could install him as the head of a puppet government in northern Italy. And the Mossad, tracked him down to Spain, where he was living, in retirement under Franco's regime. And one night, Skorzeny goes out. He and his wife, they meet a young couple, and they're drinking and talking and so forth. And they go back to Skorzeny's place, and Skorzeny pulls out a gun and says, "Listen, I know you guys are with the Mossad. Are you here to kill me?" And the Mossad agents say, basically, no, listen, we wanted to kill you. We'd have killed you already. We're here because we want to recruit you for this operation to kill the scientists. And Skorzeny seems to be enlisted. We don't know if it was because he felt some guilt or was afraid of the Israelis or just missed the adventure, but apparently participated in this campaign and killed at least one of the scientists himself. This is sort of the period where Israel's reputation for its kind of daring and remarkable intelligence activities starts to come into fruition. They themselves had two very well-placed spies in Egypt and Syria. On the left, you have a guy named Wolfgang Lotz over here in the Jodhpurs. Lotz had, kind of funny story, Lotz was the son of a German father and Jewish mother who had left Germany in the 1930s, goes to Palestine, serves in the Haganah, serves in the British Army, interrogating German prisoners of war for the North African campaign. Looks like a German, speaks perfect German, knows a lot about the North African campaign. And so he is sent to Egypt to sort of pass himself off as a former German officer who'd served in North Africa, and sets up a riding school which appeals to sort of German expatriates, but also Egyptian elites in Egypt. And funny thing is that his mother, not only did she marry a German, but she was so sort of uninterested in her Jewish identity that she never had young Wolfgang circumcised. So he could really pass as a German, which he did successfully for a number of years. And even when the Egyptians caught him, he was able to convince them that he was spying for the Germans and not for the Israelis, which probably saved his life. More well known was, of course, Israel's spy on the Syrian front, Eli Cohen, located over here, who did basically the same thing, right? Passed himself off as a Syrian emigre who had been spending time in Brazil, gets in good with important people in Syria's political movements, would give him tours of the front and, all kinds of things, and is feeding the Israelis. And both these men are arrested in 1965. Cohen is executed. Lutz is eventually traded back for Egyptian prisoners after the 6-Day War. So the Israelis were certainly not inactive, but not necessarily in a traditional military sense against Egypt. As for Syria, without having to worry about Egypt, Israel is really able to focus on the Syrian front. And there are three basic issues for the Israelis in Syria. One is Syrian operations to divert water, and we'll talk about that more in a minute. Two is operations in response to Syrian support for Fatah and other terrorist groups. Fatah began in 1959 and was operating on a Syrian territory. And three, operations designed to test Syria on the DMZ. So let's look at each of these. Israel, some of you may be aware, doesn't have a whole lot of water. And most of the water that they had at this point nowadays, thankfully, they have a pretty extensive desalination network, which provides much of their water. But at the time, most of their water was coming from the Jordan and the Kinneret. And then they were building in 1965, or they've been building it for some years, something called the National Water Carrier, which is designed to carry water right from the Kinneret to other parts of Israel that needed it. The problem with the water from the Jordan is that the headwaters and sources that it depended on were in Arab territory. Syria began efforts to try and divert the water through canals to various other sources. Israel is going to launch a bombing campaign against those construction efforts. In 1965, Fatah launched its first military operation, which was an attack against the water carrier, which not terribly successful, but it shows at least that they're trying. And then the other issue was the DMZ, which we'll talk about in a few minutes. So the early Fatah attacks were not terribly important. In 1966, though, November 1966, there is a mine detonated in Israel, killed a number of soldiers. Israel assumed that this was done by Fatah unit operating out of Jordan. The Jordanians themselves were, willing to work with the Israelis. This is one of those things where kind of a breakdown in communications. The Jordanians sent a message to the Israelis through the American ambassador, who did not get it in time or didn't transmit it in time. End result is that Israel decided to launch a significant attack in Jordan and the village of Samu, which is where the Fatah unit was supposed to be operating from. The Jordanian army responds. Several hours of fighting. Jordanians 16 killed, a bunch injured, a bunch of vehicles destroyed. Okay. So I apologize for those I muted, but there's a sound there. U.S. is not happy with this, right? Jordan was viewed as a friendly state in a fairly unfriendly region. Certainly King Hussein was certainly aligned himself more with the West than with the Russians. Being a king, not so unreasonable. The Israeli government was not sure this was a good idea. But the real important backlash of this is that King Hussein very publicly accuses Nasser of hiding behind the skirts of the United Nations emergency force, and that's the language that's used, right? Here we are fighting the Israelis. The Zionist entity is invading Arab land, killing Arabs, and what's Nasser doing about it? Nothing, right? Because he can't go through the UN. And for Nasser, right, this was really adding insults to a decade of injury here. And when we look at why Nasser decides to act the way he acts in May, as we'll see, May 67, it's generally assumed that a lot of that has to do with sort of his feeling that he needed to restore his own street cred in the Arab street. And there's the issue of the DMZ. So after the 49 armistice, there was a demilitarized zone, right, created between Israel and Syria along various places, which both sides interpreted differently. From the Israeli perspective, the DMZ meant that there should be no Israeli military forces operating there. From the Syrian perspective, it meant that there should be no Israelis there at all, right? So what you have is this kind of cat and mouse game over the course of the early 1960s, where the Israelis would send farmers into or armored bulldozers, right, into the DMZ to begin plowing and getting ready to farm and so forth. The Syrians would shell various settlements and try and push this stuff back. Israel would then launch airstrikes against the Syrian positions, and this would then quiet things down for a few months until the Israelis tried it again. This culminated in April 1967 with the biggest clash yet, right? Israelis send in a bunch of bulldozers, the Syrians do their thing. Israel sends in planes, the Syrians send in a large, and the Syrians had been buying up a lot of new Soviet weapons. I think maybe they wanted to show what they could do and demonstrate a certain amount of deterrence. They send up a large force against the Israelis send up more planes. And it's a bad day for the Syrians, right? Half a dozen Syrian planes are shot down, some of them in sight of Damascus. The Israelis, again, adding insult to injury, are going to, do an overflight over Damascus. So there's the specter of Israeli planes, right, flying over Damascus, which is, again, not a great look for the Syrian regime. And, in the wake of this, what ensues is which is still a big mystery, right? And historians have a number of theories about this, but what the Soviets notify the Egyptians that they have intelligence that Israel is planning an attack on Syria. And Israel wasn't, and there's no evidence that they were. The Israelis call in the UN to say, hey, listen, we don't know where this stuff is coming from. We know what the Soviets are saying. You can check. We don't have, we're not making plans to invade Syria. The best theory is that what would happen is something that had happened before. Nasser would reinforce the Sinai. The Israelis would back down from whatever they're doing with Syria, right? Because again, they would have to move troops to deal with Nasser, and everything would calm down, right? Ima, you should probably turn off one of your Zoom things because it's making a noise. So that's why I keep muting you. At any rate, so this was a huge miscalculation, right? What it seems is the Soviets were trying to bail out their Syrian client, assuming that a credible show of force by Nasser would ultimately lead the Israelis to withdraw from what they're doing in Syria and things would go back to the status quo. Well, this is where, again, they perhaps did not anticipate Nasser's sort of desire to restore his own status in the Arab world. So over the course of May, Nasser does a number of things. He orders reinforcements to the Sinai near the border of Israel, right? So 2 divisions are sent in, right? Good, that's what the Egyptians, what the Soviets wanted. What the Soviets were not counting on, however, was the next thing. Nasser orders the UN forces to be withdrawn from Egypt, which, this is one of those things where people don't know what exactly Nasser had intended. Did he really think they were going to do it? Did he think the UN would make it difficult, right? Would it be the sort of thing that allowed him to say, hey, look, I told the UN to leave. They refused to go, right? What can you do? But Uthant is the head of the UN General Assembly at the time. He's like, okay, well, we can't stay there if you don't want us there. He withdraws the UN emergency forces, and not just from the border with Israel, but from the Straits of Tiran as well. Which some argue that Nasser wasn't intending for that, but the UN says we're not staying in part of it and not the other part, so we're leaving the whole thing. Nasser shuts the Strait of Tiran, which Israel had declared would be an act of war. And again, Israel, not a lot of Israeli ships pass through there, but a lot of oil to Israel passed through there. And Nasser left it kind of vague as to whether or not he would prevent foreign ships carrying oil for Israel to pass through. He had declared that no strategic shipments would pass through, and oil is pretty strategic, so the Israelis assumed that was the case. And Egypt and Jordan signed a defensive alliance and agree that in wartime, both militaries would be placed under Egyptian command. So by the end of May, you have Egyptian troops reinforcing the Sinai and moving into position for what we'll see in a minute. Nasser closes the Strait of Tiran. And you have the militaries of Egypt, Jordan, and Syria, all under unified Egyptian command. And the rhetoric coming out of Egypt is and coming out of the Arab world in general, is increasingly hostile. Right. The battle will be a general, and our basic objective will be to destroy Israel. Taking over Sharm el-Sheikh meant confrontation with Israel. It also meant that we were ready to enter a general war with Israel. It was not a separate operation. The president of Iraq said the existence of Israel is an error which must be rectified. This is an opportunity to wipe out the ignominy which had been with us since 1948. Hafez al-Assad, who was the defense minister or head of the Air Force, I think, and I don't know, maybe defense minister in Syria at the time. Our forces are now entirely ready not only to repulse the aggression, but to initiate the act of liberation itself and to explode the Zionist presence in the Arab homeland. The Syrian army, with its finger on the trigger, is united. I, as a military man, believe that the time has come to enter in a battle of annihilation. So, and Iraq announces that it's going to send an armored division into Jordan, which meant into the east, into the West Bank. The Kuwaitis announced that they're going to send an expedition force to the Sinai. Pledges begin coming in from elsewhere in the Arab world. So, everything the Israelis are seeing is they're going to read as a threat to destroy Israel. Now, there's a legitimate question as to whether or not Nasser actually intended war, right? That, like I said, some people think he may have hoped the UN would slow things down. In the first few weeks, his language is more guarded, right? Meaning saying that Egypt would respond to Israeli aggression, but not claiming an offensive itself. And that changes by the end of May. And I would point out that by the end of May, Nasser also says the existence of Israel is in itself an aggression, right? So when he says that he's going to respond to Israeli aggression, it's not really clear what he means by that. And it's something else to point out, right? Although it seems laughable in hindsight, at the time, Nasser and the Egyptian military leadership thought their military was superior to Israel's, right? So when some people look and say, oh, well, but the Americans thought the Israelis would win, the Israelis thought the Israelis would win, that's all well and good, but the Egyptians thought that they could win, right? Their military was large, their military alone, right, was larger than Israel's. They had more tanks alone than Israel did. They had more planes alone than Israel did. And that's not even concluding that, the Syrian and the Jordanians. Nasser had spent the last decade building the Egyptian military, preparing, right, for this moment to a great extent. Even in 56, Nasser and many Arabs had blamed the disaster. Look, if you look at 48, a lot of Arabs blamed the failure of 48 and 49 on the old Arab regimes. Those old Arab regimes are gone, right, replaced by people like Nasser. 56, Nasser could say, and a lot of Arabs would agree, that the failure against Israel in 56 was because of the British and the French, right? And not entirely incorrectly, right? I mean, certainly the degree to which Israel moved was certainly facilitated in part by British and French help. And Nasser was ambivalent about starting the war, but not necessarily because of Israel, right? Nasser viewed the United States as his main enemy. In this extent, he viewed Israel as more of a pawn of the U.S. And, his feeling was that he needed to let Israel perhaps start the war, launch the first aggression, because if he had launched it, right, then the Americans might use it as the pretext to get involved as well. But he believed that the Egyptian army was ready for this. And look, those people will argue that, Nasser, would not have gone to war with Israel because of, Israeli superiority. I'd say that, in 1973, just 6 years later, Egypt and Syria attack Israel when they lack the geographic advantage of the Sinai, the Golan Heights, and the West Bank. In June '67, there's a unified Arab military command. They have tremendous demographic and territorial advantages. They believed that they had superior material and training and all this other stuff. No reason to conclude that Israel would have been incorrect to assume, whether it was or not, that Nasser would have gone to war. And the rhetoric is becoming increasingly bellicose. And ultimately, it doesn't really matter what Nasser wanted to do or what he really was going to do. The fact is that it would have been perfectly plausible for Nasser to have intended to go to war from the start. It's perfectly plausible for Nasser to have never intended to go to war. And I'd say it's also probably the most plausible thing, which is you would see the same thing that the Arab leadership saw in 1948, right? That constant saber rattling, constant promises that they're going to destroy Israel might have just been, for the sake of public consumption. But at some point, the public is going to demand action. And I imagine that, maybe on May 15th, Nasser was not planning to go with Israel. But if you got to June 15th and Iraqi reinforcements were in the West Bank and Kuwaitis were coming in and the Saudis coming in, whoever, not unreasonable to conclude that Nasser would have attacked Israel. And certainly the Israelis were reasonable to conclude that. Now, from the Israeli side of things, also worth pointing out, the Israelis themselves knew that, in fact, Nasser, or at least the Egyptian military, actually was planning an attack. And then they stepped down from it, right, in part because of Israeli intervention. So on May 25th, Israeli intelligence got a report that Egypt was planning an attack on Israel within 48 hours. And this seems to be the case, right? So this is one of the things we don't have. The Egyptians have never opened up their archives. It's somewhat limited what we know, but it does seem that there's a plan on May 27th for Egypt to launch an attack on Israel. The attack was called Operation Dawn. There was the plan of General Abdel Hakim Amer, who was one of Nasser's closest friends, but also one of his main rivals. Right, he was the head of the military, and again, a lot of the military were loyalists and been appointed by him. Abba Eban goes in the 25th to meet with the U.S. Secretary of State, provides him with that intelligence. Eventually, he's passed on to LBJ. And LBJ at first thinks probably the Israelis are just overreacting, but to be on the safe side, he calls the Soviet premier, Alexei Kosygin, tell him that he'd heard that Egypt was planning an attack on the Israelis. Kosygin hadn't heard about it. He calls Nasser to find out what's going on. Nasser summons Amer and asks him what's the story. And Amer tells him, and this is on the morning of May 27th, that the Egyptian Air Force is ready to attack, right? He's standing there, the head of the Air Force is there. So in 45 minutes, we're ready to launch a strike against Israeli air bases. And the plan was then to invade and try and grab the Negev and Eilat. And Nasser called off the attack, right? So, the question about whether or not Nasser was going to go to war or not, the Israelis knew, in fact, that there were figures in the Egyptian military who were planning an attack. And from their perspective, the only question is going to be when. Now, just like there is no one Arab opinion on going to war with Israel, right? And you had, people who were more hawkish and more dovish. Same thing applies in Israel. As a rule, government ministers, the civilians, tended to be older, tended to be foreign-born, and far more worried about going to war, right? They had their doubts and hesitation. Ben Gurion, who was in retirement, but still a loud presence, had often thought that Israel should not go into these conflicts without great power support, which is why it lined that up in 56. But Israel's generals were Sabras in most cases. They'd been training and fighting for this moment their entire lives. They were far more confident about Israel's prospects if it could be fought on their terms, right? So the generals, who are also some of them very stressed out, Rabin in late May has more or less a mental collapse for like a day or so, or a nervous breakdown for a day or so, and recovers very quickly there. These guys wanted to go to war. They wanted to do it quickly. They wanted to do it on their terms. And this kind of, you know, duality among Israelis, best term for it is Levi Eshkol, who was prime minister at the time. And although a lot of that generation were very anti-Yiddish, Eshkol was a fan of the language. I mean, they all spoke it, but like telling Yiddish jokes and so forth, coined the phrase Shimshon the Nebuchdicker, right? So Shimshon the Nebuchdicker, it means Shimshon, Samson, right, is strong, but the Nebuchdicker is a Nebish is he's kind of a loser, right? A wimp, a weakling, an unfortunate figure. So to Eshkol, this is kind of defining the Israeli character, right? On the one hand, you've got this military strength and great potential. On the other hand, it's a country that had, you know, gone through the Holocaust, that had gone through 2 wars, that was living in constant fear and dread, and uncertainty as to what the future is going to bring, right? So both of these elements were in place at the time. And certainly some Israeli generals were extremely bellicose. Rabin, who was chief of staff, had suggested recently that Israel should invade Syria and topple the regime there. But in the wake of Nasser's actions, and I'm going to put it as Nasser that changed the status quo, we can say 3 things about Israeli planning. One, the civilian leadership was in control. And the civilian leadership was, of course, the more dovish faction. There was much more hesitant to go to war. Insofar as war is being planned, and this is very important, it was a war against Egypt, right? There is a sort of wide anti-Israel mythology that the 67 war was this sort of expansionist war on the part of Israel, but as we're going to see, Israel was really looking simply to restore the situation with Egypt, reopen the Straits of Tiran, and demonstrate Israeli deterrent power, right? But Israel certainly was not interested at this point in a broad expansionist war. And if anything, we're kind of surprised by what happened and how successful things were. And to a great extent, the Israeli government at this point is looking to the American government for clues as to what it should do. And both Nasser and Eshkol are trying to gain assurances from their patrons, right? Nasser is talking to the Soviets. His feeling is that as long as Egypt doesn't attack, the Soviets will back him up, and most importantly, will keep the United States from intervening. The United States at first calls for patience, right? When the Straits of Tiran are closed, Johnson says to the Israelis, "Look, I'm going to put together an international flotilla. We will, challenge the blockade ourselves." But not much is happening on those grounds, right? And it's worth pointing out, as we're going to see this again in '73, the United States is in the middle of the war in Vietnam. It is not interested in a conflict in the Middle East. It's not interested in channeling manpower and spending capital on what's going on there. So Johnson is extremely supportive of Israel. He's extremely friendly towards Jews in a sort of collective way. But this is not something that the U.S. is prepared to get involved in. But in the beginning of June, Major General Meir Amit, who is the head of Mossad and of Israeli military intelligence, meets with Secretary of Defense Bob McNamara. And it's a kind of funny conversation, right? They're talking about Israel's plans. They're talking about what Israel might do. He senses that McNamara has shifted away from hesitation. He sort of says to McNamara, "Look, I'm not going to ask you what Israel should do because I'm going to give you plausible deniability. Israel is planning to take steps to resolve the situation. McNamara doesn't tell him not to, right? McNamara doesn't say slow down. And Amit reports back to Eshkol that the Americans have given their tacit approval for Israeli action. And as for the population of Israel itself, look, the fact is, the Israeli population was not looking at this war in a jingoistic way. All over Israel, people are digging trenches, foxholes. The government is stockpiling body bags. There is a fear and dread that this war is going to be a bloodbath for Israel. And in fact, we have a special guest tonight. My mother, who was living in Israel at the time, Ima. Are you there? Is my mother there?
Listen.
Yes, Ima. Are you there? Ima? You're mute. You're mute, Ima. You're muted. Can't hear you. All right. Well, if my mother starts to speak, then what?
Hello?
Okay, Ima, you have two Zoom things on. You have to turn one of them off.
Constant echo.
Yes, because you have two applications open. You have to close one of your Zoom apps.
I have two what?
Okay.
Oh, just forget it. Forget it. Whatever. Just keep talking.
Okay, now I fixed it. Go ahead, you can talk.
I can talk? What do you want me to talk about?
I fixed it. Well, what was it like being in Israel in May and early June 1967?
Okay. Oh, now it says you removed me from the meeting.
Okay, here's what I was saying before. You had two Zoom windows open. That's why there was the echo. So I closed one of them.
I know, but then the screen just said you removed me from the
I know,
meeting.
but clearly I didn't. I removed one
All
of
right,
yours.
all right. What was it like to be in Israel? Well, first of all, being Americans, and I was totally American. Your father, as you know, was a refugee from the Holocaust as a child. So he was more used to being scared of, So when they said that we were warned, just as people were in the Sudan a little while ago, Americans were warned to leave because America knew there was going to be a war starting. So they said all Americans should leave. Well, we decided not to leave. We decided to stay. And I remember I was so unused to the concept of actually being in a war that Yael, your sister, had lost one of her shoes in the park. And I went to the park, not worrying about, the fact bombs might.
You went to Yad Vashem and took one from a pile.
Yes, exactly. I remember how that our neighbors, our Israeli neighbors, we lived in an apartment building, were astounded at the fact we were staying because they thought we were cowardly Americans. I remember going to the supermarket, it was packed with people buying things. I remember turning on we listened to the radio. We had to sit in the basement a lot of times. Me, your father, your 2-year-old sister. I was pregnant with your brother. And we had sit in the basement because we might have been bombed. And we would listen to the radio, we being all the people in the building. And the Arab radio made, English broadcasts, just as Israeli ones did too. And in the broadcast, it said that blood would run in the streets of Tel Aviv. Prepare, blood is going to run. And it also said, warn Jewish women to prepare also. And what they had to prepare for was rape.
Well,
So
that or gefilte fish. I mean,
what?
That or gefilte fish, right? Maybe they wanted a nice Shabbos meal when they showed up.
But it was a bit scary. And I also remember that a day or so before the war ended, there was a report on the radio that LBJ was going to send the Sixth Fleet to Tel Aviv. And I thought, how is he going to know I'm here? How is he going to rescue me? So those were, of course it was scary, but it ended quickly, thank God. And I remember how excited we were when, Israeli forces went to the wall. And they were crying. The rabbi was crying, chief rabbi was with them. And it was very, very powerful. So those are my memories. But LBJ did not rescue me.
Well, it turned out all right though. So, well,
Yes,
I'm sure he sensed that you were in good hands. All right.
yes.
So, on the morning of June 5th, Israel launched Operation Moked, means Operation Focus. And Israel had been planning this moment for years, right? They had intelligence in every Egyptian air base, every Egyptian pilot. They knew the schedules, they knew the operating procedures. They had got a hold of the main Egyptian fighter plane, MiG-21. An Iraqi pilot had defected to Israel a year earlier. The Israelis had smuggled his family out of Iraq to allow him to bring the plane over. So they had recordings of every pilot in the Egyptian Air Force, right? I mean, so they could identify who was in the plane or whatever. So they had done this as well as humanly possible. The attack was planned to take place after the Dawn Patrol had landed. Between the feeling was that between 7 and 8, right? The pilots who had just landed, the planes were being refueled, the pilots are eating breakfast. The base commanders are still on their way to their offices. So it would be the ideal time, right? The Egyptians would be the least prepared. The airfields would be the most vulnerable, and there'd be the most confusion. And so they had planned all this very, very well. And at 7:15 a.m., virtually the entire operational strength of the IDF was committed for strikes against the Egyptian airfields, primarily in the Sinai, but beyond as well. The plan was to fly out into the Mediterranean, fly west, and then fly back over Sinai from the west, so that radars, if they picked them up, would assume that they were Egyptian planes, right, coming from the west. And it's one of those moments where, you can call it just blind luck. You can say that miracles happen through natural means. But even with all the planning that the Israelis had done, they ended up with one further bonus that they had not counted on. So Field Marshal Amer, right, the one I spoke about before, the commander of the Egyptian military, he and the Egyptian Air Force commander were flying into Egypt that morning. They were actually having breakfast, as the Israelis had imagined, when the first bombs started dropping. But because the Egyptian military is afraid that some trigger-happy anti-aircraft crews would shoot down the commander of the military, they had given instructions not to fire on any incoming planes that day, at least not any coming from the west. So, we don't know what would have happened. We assume that the attack would have been still pretty successful, but the Israelis swoop in, and not only are there no planes to greet them, there's no anti-aircraft fire as well. And the 7:45, the bombs start falling, and the attack, it goes beyond Israel's wildest dreams, right? They had it staggered. So the first wave was dropping the bombs. As they were pulling away, the second wave was coming in. As the first wave was dropping, the third wave was taking off. So it wasn't just 3 waves. As the third wave is then hitting, whereas they didn't have to fly over the Mediterranean, they could fly directly. That first wave is already back in Israel refueling. So the Israelis are able to fly multiple sorties over the course of the day. They would first crater the airstrip, right, make sure no planes could take off, then hit the long-range bombers to protect my mother, apparently, and then hit the fighter aircraft. And by the end of the day, actually by the end of a few hours, pretty much the entire Egyptian Air Force is destroyed, mostly on the ground. And it was one of the most, sort of like, again, very few things compared to it. I mean, in one day and a few hours, I mean, you could look and say, Pearl Harbor, but the fact is that even Pearl Harbor, the bulk, the most important ships in the American fleet weren't hit. U.S. military power was able to recover fairly quickly. Egypt's Air Force, the most powerful Arab Air Force, was destroyed at almost no cost to Israel. Egypt still was dug in, though, right? The Egyptian military was still dug in. The Sinai is a big desert. It is difficult to go through. The Egyptians or the Israelis did have, again, their own plans then to invade the Sinai. They launched an assault up here, a place called Abu Agela, destined to break through the first line of Egyptian defenses. The Egyptians had several. And Marshal Amir panicked, right? So, this is, again, one of those things which, for all the Israelis planned, this is something which just sort of fell in their laps, that the commander of the army gave orders for the Egyptian army to retreat or withdraw, I'm sure they said, from the Sinai. And the withdrawal soon became a rout, right? I mean, the Egyptians were panicked. Right, the soldiers, all they see is Israeli planes flying all day long and nobody from their side. Soldiers are leaving their tanks, they're leaving artillery, they're leaving their shoes, because it's easier to walk in the desert in bare feet. And you see here Israeli Egyptian prisoners, a lot of these guys are barefoot. Horrible experience for the Egyptians, right? Thousands die right over the course of several days in the desert. But for the Israelis, success beyond their wildest dreams. And what even at this point, though, this might have just been a repeat of 56, right? A humiliation for Nasser in Egypt, but not necessarily a larger blow to the Arab world. But Nasser could not admit what was happening. And not only could he not admit, but he gave the word to his propaganda people, right? The same people who were, speaking to my mother, were given instructions to present a case that Egypt was winning the war. Ahmed Said, who is the chief announcer and voice of the Arabs, which was the most important Egyptian radio show with listeners all over the Arab world, is going on and talking about major Egyptian victories. 75% of the Israeli Air Force destroyed, Egyptian tanks, right, plunging through Israel, bombers over Tel Aviv, and all over the Arab world, right? Arab listeners think this is the moment at hand, right? This is the time to erase their humiliation. And with that, right, the rest of the Arab leaders, of course, are going to fall in. Right? King Hussein, who, again, was always, right, his family's always the most lukewarm about going to war with Israel. He had been personally told by Amer that 75% of Israel's air force is destroyed. Most of his population are Palestinians. Right? They are, if anything, have been pushing him to go to war. And he, for years, had been trying to, right, sort of tamp things down. And he begins operations in Israel. Right, the Jordanians seize a high ground. They begin preparing attack Israeli bases. They begin shelling Israeli positions. And the Israelis, and this is why, again, it simply is absurd to say that this is a war of expansion on Israel's part. Even with the Jordanians shelling them, the Israelis said to Hussein, "Listen, if you stay out, we'll leave you alone." Right? Even keep in mind, it's still just the first day of the war. Anything could happen. So they're not interested in opening up another front with Jordan. Most of their military is down with Egypt. And they figure, okay, Hussein has to take some action to sort of appease the Arab street. But if he pulls back, right, there'll be no war. He didn't listen. And result was that the Israelis then destroyed his air force on the ground a lot easier. And the Israelis, because of their success in Sinai, they suddenly have troops freed up. So again, when looking at Israeli plans, they didn't have a plan to take the old city. It so happened that the Israelis were advancing so quickly in the Sinai that a scheduled parachute drop was canceled. And there's this, battalions of paratroopers who are available to take the old city, which is what happened. Of course, the famous picture here. This again was a something which many Israelis had dreamed about. But at the time, the Israeli army and government was not, necessarily planning for this. And for all the role that Syria played in all this, for the first few days, Israel barely engaged with Syria. And again, for those who argue this was a land grab. It's really not until the very end of the war that things have gone so well on the other fronts that Israeli leadership, and again, a number of the prominent figures in the Israeli military, like David Elazar and Moshe Dayan, who's Secretary of Defense at the time, were from the north, said, you know what, this is too good an opportunity to waste. Syria had attacked Israel. The Israelis had destroyed their air force as well. The Israelis got word that on June 9th that Soviets were pushing for a ceasefire, that Egypt and Syria were going to accept it. And the Israelis decided, you know, we better grab what we can in the Golan Heights before the ceasefire goes into effect, which they do over the course of June 9th to 10th. And looking at both the Soviets and the Americans highlights the degree to which Britain and France had faded, right? This was a war in which France and England really, nobody was calling on them. Nobody was expecting them to play a role. Nobody wanted them to play a role. The Soviets were all in behind their supporters, behind the Syrians and the Egyptians. The U.S. almost by default has to support Israel, both because of the Jewish vote and politics here, but also because again it would look bad if the Soviet proxies won. So the U.S. is going to throw its backing to Israel. But not to the extent that the Arabs presented, right? So it's one of these funny things where Nasser very early on begins to claim that the Americans are bombing and the Israelis are getting help from the United States. The Israelis actually captured a recording or intercepted a recording of Nasser speaking to Hussein, where the two of them together agree to begin telling this story about U.S. and England attacking the Arab world with aircraft carriers, just making this up, which did not do much for Nasser's rep there either. In fact, the U.S. Is not involved in the only U.S. ship that was involved in the conflict was one attacked by Israel on June 8th. Israeli torpedo boats, an aircraft attack, a U.S. spy ship called the USS Liberty, which is about 25 miles off the coast of Sinai. So very controversial issue in U.S.-Israeli relations. Depending on your point of view, either it was a horrible error on the part of the Israeli Air Force and Navy, or it was part of a sinister Israeli conspiracy to keep the U.S. from learning about Israeli plans and so forth, which given that the U.S. didn't seem to care what Israel is doing at this point, it doesn't seem very convincing. And the most recent evidence would suggest that there's probably an error on the part of Israel. Terrible error, though. Several dozen U.S. sailors were killed. Others were injured. Argument is made that for political reasons, the U.S. very quickly sort of swept this under the rug, and certainly the survivors of the USS Liberty have not been happy with how this thing has been dealt with. Anyway, as far as the winners and losers of the war, Egypt definitely a loser, but not necessarily Nasser. He offered to resign. Right, he goes on the radio, offers his resignation, and the people take to the streets to demand that he stay on. And some of this was manipulation, right? They did have political figures going out and whipping people up, but it does seem that again, for a lot of Egyptians, Nasser still represented their dreams and aspirations, right? I mean, they apparently couldn't, imagine, let's say, without him and for all of his failures, he had stood up to the imperialists, he stood up to the Zionists, he had tried to do his best for Egypt, and apparently that kind of for something with them. But he was never, for the next 3 years of his life, never the same, right? I mean, Nasser had been brought to earth. Amer, again, who'd been one of Nasser's great friends since the military academy days, is arrested and dies under suspicious circumstances. Some should say it was poison. Other high-ranking officers are tried and convicted for treason and so forth as a result of the war. The Soviet Union is a winner. Right. Its proxies did a bad job, but those proxies go back to the trough, right? The Syrians and the Egyptians go back to the Soviets. They need more weapons. They need more training. They need Soviet backing in the UN. And it is clear to everybody that the only two real power brokers in the region now are the United States and the USSR. Jordan definitely lost. Again, but badly, they lose a huge territory. They lose East Jerusalem and the Old City and the holy sites. Although Hussein, to some extent, kind of can be said to have gained by default. He had sided with the Arab struggle. He had sacrificed for the Arab struggle. And his losses, right, no worse than Nasser's. And with Nasser humbled, Hussein was sort of, de facto elevated in the Arab world. Globally, Jews won. And again, for those who were alive at the time, this kicks off a burst of Jewish pride. It's the late 60s, time of Black pride and gay pride and Latino pride or Hispanic pride or whatever it was at the time. In the United States at the time, they're probably separately Mexican pride and Puerto Rican pride. And the sort of Latino pride meshes later on. So this is a perfect opportunity for Jews to sort of jump in on that, right? It's not just Jews proud of themselves. Others begin to look at Jews, let's say, with a newfound source of respect as well, which sometimes manifests in strange ways. So in Poland, the government of Poland, which is, of course, a war-set back country, is going to use this as a pretext for another burst of anti-Semitism. Jews are expelled from government service. Jews are expelled from the army. There's an exodus of Jews from Poland. But among the Polish population, there is this kind of outpouring of pride and celebration in the notion that they are Jews, right? Ashkenazi Jews from Poland had defeated Russia's Arabs, right? So in this sense, lots of Poles sort of identified with the Jews as, being many of them of Polish descent, Polish Jewish descent, and therefore, right, this is sort of a vicarious victory of Poland over their own Soviet oppressors. The Palestinians, or at least most of them, certainly lost, right? 48, 49 saw the Palestinians becoming refugees. 67 saw them becoming subjects of Israel. A couple 100,000 did seem to flee as a result of the 67 war, but the war ends very quickly. And a lot of Palestinians probably learned their lesson from 48, right? If you think you're going to pick up and flee the war and come back later, that's not going to happen. So you don't see the same kind of mass exodus you saw in 48, 49. The Israelis do leave the bridges across the Jordan open, hoping that that's going to happen, but it doesn't. For the Palestinians living in the West Bank, this is a real blow. Jordan was the one country that gave Palestinian refugees citizenship, and they go from being citizens to being subjects. In both places, they find themselves under military rule. Look, when people talk about, the Palestinians as a artificial nation, or we understand nations are formed by experiences that give a people a sense of uniqueness. In 1880, there wasn't a whole lot that separated an Arab living in the Galilee from an Arab living in Damascus. There wasn't a whole lot that connected an Arab living in the Galilee more to an Arab living in Jerusalem than to an Arab living in Damascus, right? But if you think about this period, right, you now have a people who have undergone exile. Now they're going to undergo subjugation to a foreign, right, Jewish state here. These are experiences that the other Arabs aren't going through, right? But by the end of the 1960s, certainly if not sooner, it is fair to say that the Arabs of Palestine are undergoing a set of experiences which are unique within the Arab world and go a long way to shaping a Palestinian Arab identity. One beneficiary of this, though, are going to be Palestinian terror groups, right? Fatah in particular. It was formed in 1959, begins right, acting in the mid 1960s. But the failure of the Arab states here creates an opportunity for Fatah to position itself sort of the way Nasser had after 48 as the real voice of Arab resistance, as the real actors of Arab resistance. Fatah positions itself in the Jordanian villages, a place called Karama. It soon establishes its own sort of like state within a state there, foreshadowing. And in 1968, the Israelis launch a big raid on the village, hoping to arrest large numbers of Fatah members, including their leader, Yasser Arafat. And things do not go the way the Israelis planned, right? The Palestinians show much more resistance than anticipated. The Jordanians get involved and show resistance as well. The Israelis certainly get the better of it, right? But and do seize lots of prisoners. But for an Arab peoples who are desperate for any kind of victory in a military sense, this is huge, right? That Fatah and Arafat stock skyrocket as they're seen now as the legitimate resistance against Israel. Arafat is becoming a storied figure. He does go on raids in the West Bank. The Israelis can't capture him. I'm just going to throw out an idea here, which may find compelling or not. But a lot of people have noted that Yasser Arafat and Ringo Starr look very similar. There's a that as the Beatles break up, Fatah is taking off, right? Maybe not. That's something for future historians to deal with. And of course, the big winner is Israel. Israel is going to demonstrate its ability to again defeat the unified Arab world, and in a devastating way for the Arabs, right? When you look at sort of the mythology of Israel, a lot of it really begins in the 6-Day War, right? The Nebuch Dicker is gone. Israel is now Shimshon. The reputation that Israel has to this day for its military precision, its invincibility, stems a great extent to this 6 days. A nation which had been shaped by the Holocaust, which had, right, seemed on the verge of destruction, is now celebrating its victory, celebrating its own prowess, its own pride, its own ability to defend itself, and in a remarkable way. And the problem, though, is that Israel came to believe its own press. That before the war, there were a lot of voices in Israel talking about, well, what should we do if we win? Do we trade? Do we do? How does this war end? The sheer scope and speed of Israel's victory, though, changes the equations. And it's worth pointing out, without question, the Arab world very forthrightly said they are not interested in peace with Israel, right? In September in Khartoum, Sudan, the Arab League meets. They issue what are called the 3 no's, right? No recognition with Israel, no negotiations with Israel, no peace with Israel, right? Pretty straightforward. But by the same token, the Israelis don't feel any great need to pursue those things anyway, right? Because why should they, right? They had destroyed 3 Arab armies in 6 days. They had gobbled up huge chunks of Arab territory in 6 days. They had demonstrated the superiority of their intelligence, the superiority of their air power, the superiority of their soldiers, superiority of their equipment, you name it. Right as the war ended, there was some talk in the Israeli government about trading land for peace, right? What can we give back in exchange for recognition and so forth? By American records, though, it doesn't seem that was transmitted to the Americans, right? So the general kind of traditional Israeli thing was like at these cabinet meetings, it was discussed that the Israelis would transmit to the Americans their desire to, right, negotiate with the Arabs. It doesn't seem that ultimately got transmitted to the Americans. So somebody in Israel clearly had a change of heart, and understand that from the position of Israel in the summer of 1967, right, you don't need peace with the Arab states, right? Why should you give back land? Why should you make concessions when the events of June had proven that Israel had nothing to fear from the Arab world? And little foreshadowing, that's going to lead us to our next class on the Yom Kippur War. Any questions, comments, concerns? No? With
What
that,
did you say the next subject would be?
73 War, Yom Kippur War.
Was it 73 war? Okay.
Yes, or if you prefer the Ramadan War, I try and be culturally inclusive. All right. Take care. Have a good night.
Yes.
Bye.